I got a comment last week, two people actually that I was talking to that follow us really online, and they really appreciate, and I say this quite a bit because I want them to know how thankful I am. They appreciate our approach. We don't just take a history book approach because I don't believe in that. The Bible is both timely and timeless. In the same way that God worked with ordinary people in the Old Testament and the New Testament, he can work with ordinary me and do some extraordinary things. Again, we're looking at the life of Moses, and I'm calling Moses a journey of faith because, like Moses, our life also ebb and flows. There are certain times when our faith is stronger than at other times, isn't it? There are times when I don't come out on top the way that I really should, and God still loves me, and God still works. God still works with me. We've been talking about the burning bush, and that was starting in Exodus chapter 3, and I want to finish that up today in Exodus chapter 4. Just kind of as a brief review, and then we'll start reading the first chapter of the book of Genesis. We learned about the cruel oppression of the Israelites by the Egyptians, and then God blessed the Israelites and caused the Egyptians to fear them, to attempt to ensure their control over them. And you remember we gave some shout outs. I won't review all of that now, but we gave some shout outs to some people who helped God put in place when it came to Moses' upbringing. And really we see over all of that is the hand of God really orchestrating everything about the life of Moses. Chapter 2, then we move on and we looked at this focus of this Hebrew boy, this baby that this mom loved so much, and she put him in this pseudo ark, quasi ark, and she floated it down the river, and God was in control there. And this baby ended up in the house of Pharaoh. Chapter 3, we're witnessing Moses and his experience when God calls him to go back to Egypt. Remember, he took off after committing murder, and so now it's been about 40 years. He's about 80 years old, and God's not calling him to go back to be the instrument of freeing the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. And Moses is reluctant to accept God's calling and his commission. In fact, Moses gave God a list. Actually, it's 5. We'll look at those. Moses gave God a list of 5 excuses, 5 reasons. That's where we come up with the idea of Moses beating around the burning bush. On why he was not the person to actually lead them. Like I said, right about now, Moses is about 80 years old. He did not want to go back. And again, we've said this before. He didn't want to go back to the scene of the crime. Life was pretty good. He got away. He's out of there. It's been 40 years, and he just didn't want to go back and revisit his past. But God has a strange sense of humor, a delicious, really, sense of humor, in the fact that just because we think we might be getting away or getting by with something doesn't mean that God won't send us back, if you will, to the scene of the crime so that we can actually accomplish a great work for him. So when we look at chapter 4, actually the end of 3 and chapter 4, do you remember that question that God asked Moses? He said, what is that in your hand? And I'm using that to kind of look at chapter 3 and chapter 4 together. And I want to look at Moses's excuses and make application to us versus God's assurances. For every excuse that Moses put up, God came back and God gave him an assurance. And I say this all the time. People online, I say it more in person than I do online. There's a little bit of Moses in each and every one of us. When God commissions and calls and asks us to do something, there's a little bit of Moses in all of us. Let's read a little bit. Go back to chapter 3. Not going to read the entire thing, but let's just summarize a little bit at the burning bush. Moses was now tending the flock, chapter 3, verse 1. I'll skip around chapter 3 until we get to 4. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, and he came to Mount Horeb. There an angel verse 2, of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. I think the King James says it burned, but it wasn't consumed. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see what this strange sight is and why the bush doesn't burn up. And when the Lord saw, verse 4, that he had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here am I. He said, don't come any closer. God said, take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. The old preachers here used to say God called him in his office, and his office was so holy he had to take his shoes off before he went into God's office. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. I said last time we talked about this, in the Old Testament again, there's this recurring theme. No one has ever seen the face of God and actually lived. And he said, the Lord said, I've indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of the land, as good, spacious land flowing with milk and honey. Now, verse 11 is where I want to skip to, because God has already told Moses, you're the one that I want to go back and to lead them out. And so here's Moses' first excuse about beating around, what I call beating around the burning bush. His first excuse, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring out the Israelites out of Egypt? And we said some things as to what may have played into Moses' trepidation, Moses' reticence, if you will. What did we say? Some reasons why he might, what might he be thinking right now? What we said a couple of things. What did we say? Why would he not want to go back? Number one, I don't think they had wanted posters back then, but I'm just saying, he killed a man. And though it had been 40 years, Moses didn't forget. And he also knew that people didn't forget. So one reason he didn't want to go back, if you would, to the scene of the crime. We also said something else, and I remember this one. It had been 40 years, and Moses had already had a good life, and he had already kind of put his past behind him. Why go back and dig up stuff? Leave it alone. Let bygones be bygones, and just leave it right there. And Moses put up that excuse, and every time in these 5 excuses, I want you to see this. Every time Moses puts up an excuse, God counters with an assurance. And I think it's the same with us today. God, I was preparing this week, and I was just kind of thinking, we're no different really than Moses. God has some tasks and things for us to do and things for me to do. And like Moses, I put up all kinds of excuses as to why I can't do it. But in this case, for every thing that Moses thought that he couldn't do, God counters with his assurance. Look at this. Verse 11, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring out the Israelites? Verse 12, here's God's assurance. I will be with you. You would think that's okay. All right, let's go. No. Old preachers used to go to this text and used to preach a sermon, call your arms are too short to box with God. Moses went 5 rounds with God and lost. And every single time Moses puts up an excuse, God counters with an assurance. God says, I will be with you. And this will be a sign to you that is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. The first excuse Moses put up, he was really looking at himself and his inability, and he didn't trust, and he didn't think, and like us, he didn't rely on God's ability. Round 1 goes to God. round 1 goes to God. The second excuse, verse 13. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers who sent me, and then they ask me, what's his name? Then what shall I tell them? What do you think Moses is getting at here? What's Moses getting at here? Okay, you want me to go. You want me to tell them. If they ask me who sent me, what am I supposed to tell them? What's he getting? Is he getting at something? I think he is. What's he getting at? Is he getting at something? See, Moses in this spot, I don't believe, is completely settled on the authority of God. I don't think he is yet. He will be. I don't think he is. I don't think he's completely settled on God's authority. Go ahead, Mandy. None. Well, and again, that's why I'm saying here I think we're on the same page. Here, I think it has to do with God's authority versus Pharaoh's authority. Growing up in Pharaoh's house, he had to understand Pharaoh's authority. And then, remember, back then, it was more than one God. Matter of fact, Pharaoh himself was probably considered to be a god. So, right about here, excuse number 2, I think you're right. He's having a paradigm shift, really, when it comes to authority. That second excuse that he's putting up, I think he's struggling with authority. And you're right. It's been 40 years. Life has probably been pretty good. Not too many challenges. I mean, all things considered, the life of a shepherd. But all things considered now, but back up and look at this. And again, you all know my comedic sense of humor. Look at it from Moses' standpoint just for a second. Okay, God, you want me to go stand before Pharaoh, and you want me to tell him to let the Israelites go, all because I stood before a bush? Lord, you got to help me with that. I'm sorry. I warned you. I've had a week to live with this, so I've gone through all the jokes in my brain. But look at it from Moses' perspective. Lord, I'm going to need a little more than that. I'm going to need a little more credibility. Pick a word, authority, whatever you. Lord, I'm going to need a little more than that. You want me to come tell them, and then they're going to start to grill me. And how did you come to this revelation? Well, I was standing in front of a bush that really didn't burn. It didn't consume, but it burnt. Really, Moses? Okay, back on the meds. Go back on the meds. I'm suggesting here that excuse number 2 has to do with Moses coming to grips with who God really is, God's authority. And God gives him that second assurance is God tells Moses to tell the people, I am who I am sent you. In other words, and he's going to give him some signs here in a minute, but in other words, Moses has to, first of all, get in his brain his understanding and his relationship with God, get it straight in his mind first before he can go out and tell other people. So here in this one, I think Moses is having to deal with the authority of who God really is. Questions, comments, what do you think? And this is just round 2 of 5. And I'm suggesting too, there are some things in our life, in my life, in your life, that we really got to get straight when it comes to the authority of God, or we may face some of the same things in our life that Moses faced. So that's round 2. I think it's the authority when it comes to really who God is. Look at the third one. God already told him, I'll be with you. This will be a sign when you brought the people out. You'll be able to worship in this mountain. Look at verse 13. What is his name? I am who I am. Says, this is my name forever. Then you'll go and assemble to the Israelites. What if they, again, this is what I said earlier, put yourself in the shoes of Moses. You've come face to face with your skeptics and convinced them that God sent you based upon a conversation you had with a bush, in front of a bush. He didn't think anybody would believe him. God's assurance gave him 3 miraculous signs. You remember what those signs were? And they don't have to be in order. But God kind of proved himself a little bit when it came to Moses. You remember what God had him do, those 3 miraculous signs? Give me one. All right, the staff. And this is where Mandy and I agree, and we both couldn't do it. I speak for myself. I can't speak for Mandy. I couldn't do it. Here, what's in your hand, staff? Throw it on the ground. Okay. Ooh, it became a snake. All right. Pick it up. Sorry. I just my humanity gets in the way. But he did that. The staff. What else happened? Put his hand, I think it became leprous. He put it in his coat, cloak, whatever, and pulled it out. It was leprous. Put it in again, pulled it out. It became clean, white as snow. You remember the other one? There was one more. And he also said, now Lord, and this one's funny to me, he reminded God, it's almost like reminding the architect of the building that you're walking through. Lord, in case you forgot, I don't speak so good. Okay, I got you covered. Aaron, you're going with him. All right, next. You know, again, I think this is funny on one level, it's serious on another. We put up all kinds of excuses when it comes to what God commissions us to do. And like Moses, whenever we run out of excuses, it's time to just do what God said to do. But in each one of those events, I see a common theme, and that is, you know, when it comes to doing what God wants us to do, we don't have to be eloquent. Just tell what you know. Just tell what God did for me. And I used to say this all the time. When we talk about inviting people to worship, inviting people to come and worship with us, you don't have to go into a long Bible study. And if it does lead to a Bible study, it's not as convoluted and complicated as we make it out. Listen, this is what God did for me. Tell what you know. Tell your own experience. My own experience is the best testimony when it comes to a relationship with God. I don't know if I ever told you this or not. After I obeyed the gospel, shortly thereafter, and my friend was instrumental in helping me to obey the gospel, I went back and I actually set up a study with a friend of mine and a minister at the time, doctor now, but David Chisholm. He said, all you have to do is invite people and get them in front of where the gospel is. As a fellowship, we'll do the rest. And I thought, ooh, I like the sound of that. And when I invited my friend to come to worship, he enjoyed it. He had a couple of questions, and I went to the minister. The minister said, no, I could answer those questions, but you're more equipped to answer his questions than I am. And I went, whoa, wait a minute. I've only been, and it may have been a couple of months after I was baptized. He said, I never will forget this. He said, Freddie, just tell him what you know. Tell him what God did for you. That's all he's asking. He's not asking for all these convoluted Bible answers, and I could do that. It's unnecessary. But he's asking you. And all you need to do is just tell him what God did for you. You know, guys, that was simple. And my friend Frank obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. We lost touch shortly after high school. Frank stayed in the Atlanta metro area, but last I heard, and this was probably 10, 12 years ago, Frank was still a active member of the Lord's church. I think he was serving as a deacon last I heard. And it wasn't anything complicated. I just told him what I knew. This is what God did for me. And I couldn't help think about this week when I was working on this. That's all God wanted Moses to do. And those 3 signs, if you'll think about them, y'all remember them, they were a precursor, and we'll be here week after next. Those were a precursor to the plagues that were going to come when Moses was going to confront Pharaoh. Those were kind of a precursor. This was kind of a preview of what was yet to come. So all God wanted Moses to do was get it straight in his own mind. Just tell what you know. Just tell what God has done for you. Just tell what has happened to you, Moses, and then I'll take care of the rest. Questions, comments, what do you think? The fourth excuse Moses comes up with, at a certain point, I really think, and we're going to see this, I think, in excuse number 5. At a certain point, don't you have to applaud the patience of God? I mean, don't really? But at a certain point, like any parent, doesn't your patience wear a little thin? But look at excuse number 4. Go down to chapter 4, and it's actually verse 10, but a little further down. Moses tells God he couldn't go, and this is what Mandy said earlier, because he couldn't speak eloquently. He was slow of speech. In some cases, people think it was a speech impediment or he stuttered. Moses is still hung up about his inability rather than trusting and relying on God's ability. Now, that one hit me straight in the face. That hits me straight in the face. Because sometimes I put up excuses as to what God wants me to do and how God wants me to do it. And I put up excuses, and it's based on my inability, and I kind of sidestep the fact of God's ability. I've been back to Baker Heights to preach a couple of times, and I've been to Mender Street and some other places. And y'all might have thought I was joking, but I'm serious. I'd rather not do those. I'd rather, my personal inability is I'll just stay at home and take care of us. But I'm also commissioned to go just like everybody else. And so I put that aside. I just take a deep breath and I just go and I do what God commissions me to do. But when I kind of think about my own inadequacies, I'm really stuck like Moses. I'm stuck on my inability rather than putting that aside and then trusting in God's ability. God gave him, again, his assurance to that. Listen, I got you. We're going to send Aaron with you. You're going to have a yoke fellow. And I can almost imagine the look on Moses' face right about now. That's not the answer. That's not the answer that Lord, I really think, and this is just kind of what I think, Lord, I'm really kind of wishing you'd let me off the hook. I'm almost convinced that wasn't what was on Moses' mind at that particular point. What do you think? Questions, comments? He was trying to wiggle out of it. He didn't want to go. I love the way I've learned to say it now since I've been in Texas. He just didn't flat stinking want to go. And that's just it. Look at the last one. And this is where I think when we drop down to verse 13 and we'll read the rest of this is where I think we see kind of a different side of God. Verse 13 said, "Who am I? They shall call me. Go assemble before the Israelites who brought you out." Moses said, "Suppose I go to them." God said, "This is who I am. This is what you ought to say." God said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, the God of your father," verse 15, "God of Isaac and Jacob have sent you. This is my name forever, the name you should call me from generation to generation. Go to the elders and set up this structure for worship. The elders then will listen to you," verse 18, "and I will make," verse 21, "the Egyptians favorably disposed towards this people." Go over to chapter 4, verse 1. And here we go. "What if they do not believe me or listen to me?" And then the Lord, saying that the Lord didn't appear to you. And this is where I got the title slide we've been looking at. He says, "What is in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. He said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground. It became a snake and he ran from it. Good man. I like that, Moses. No, I'm kidding. Then the Lord said, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So he reached out, took it hold. It was a snake, turned back into the staff. Then the Lord said, then said the Lord, "Is it so that they may believe the Lord I'm God, that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has appeared to you?" Then the Lord said, second one, "Put your hand in your cloak." Moses put his hand in his cloak and took it out. It was leprous. Then he put it back in. It became white as snow. Then the Lord said, verse number 8, if they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, then they may believe the second. If they don't believe these two signs, then listen. Take water from the Nile and pour it on the ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. See, that's why I'm saying this is a precursor to what's going on. And God really has to get Moses and his mind straight, because if the leader's mind straight, the people's mind is not going to be straight. And then verse 10, I love this one, chapter 4, verse 10. I think Moses is just about there. I can tell this because of his language, because of his attitude, because of his demeanor. Pardon your servant. Now, I see that as different in chapter 4 than it was in chapter 3. His attitude is kind of changing. Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past. I'm not good with speech. And then God says, who made your mouth? And he said, okay, verse 12, now go, I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say. Verse 13, pardon your servant again. Lord, here's the final excuse. I just don't want to do it. Please send someone else. And again, look at verse 14. This is the time we see not only Moses' paradigm shift, but I think verse 14 shows a shift when it comes to God and his response to Moses. Verse 14 says, the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he says, what about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he'll be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth, and if you were God to him. But take the staff in your hand so that you can perform these signs with it. And at that point, if it was a boxing match, and it's not, the bell rings, ding, ding, match is over. That's it. It's now time for Moses to go and do what God has commissioned him to do. Moses ran out of excuses. That was it. And God got to the point with Moses, and I like this last one, God kind of got a little upset. God's anger burned against Moses. We don't exactly know. Well, I think we have a good idea as to why. Why do you think God's anger burned against Moses a little bit? Why this change of attitude from God? What do you think? What do you see? Quit making excuses. I told you to do it. Like any parent also, and I thought about this week. I made myself a note. You know, I didn't believe this when I was younger, but now as an older man, I firmly believe this. My parents knew what I was capable of doing when I was younger, even better than I did. Now, again, you have to understand, I thought they fell off the back of a banana boat. I just did. Sorry, Ernest, I did. And that happened from about 13 till my early 20s. Late 20s, I kind of got a little bit of sense. And then an older man at church told me, Brother Garrett, I miss Brother Garrett, Britton Garrett. Brother Garrett said, let me tell you something. The older you get, the smarter your parents going to get. I didn't understand that. Ooh, I didn't understand that. But you know, Brother Garrett was right. Now, I'm going this way to say it like this. God knew Moses could do it before Moses put up the first excuse. But I think it interesting here that God finally let Moses go through his process and then just put down the fact, look, I already know you can do it. You're out of excuses. Get after it. Go get it done. Like any good parent, I think my point is, and Andy kind of said it, like any good parent, God knew what Moses was capable of even beyond what Moses knew. But Moses had to develop his faith. Moses had to develop his trust. He had to engender through this relationship with God. Now it's time to go. And Moses is going to do a tremendous work that God is calling him to do. So maybe one side of it is, you know, God already knew Moses could do it. Moses just needed to know it. Or take the leap of faith. What else do you see? What else there? Anything else? Would you leave that man alone? Yeah. Yeah, life's a little different. And again, lifespans back then were a lot longer, of course, but age has got to be something to account for. Got to be something to account for. What else do you see? Because it hadn't gotten good yet. See, to develop this faith and to take this leap of faith is one thing. Execution of that is proving to be a lot different in its logistics. And so I'll give you a peek. I'll give you a peek into next week. We got a few more minutes. Up until this point, God had been patient with Moses, but this objection kind of kindled a little anger in God. He had assured Moses of his divine presence. He had already assured Moses of his divine name, and he showed him signs, and he made him his spokesperson. In God's mind, I'm like, Moses, what else do you need? Really? And so Moses finally gets to the point where he does it. And God's assurance, okay, if you need any more assurance, look, you and Aaron just take off, and it's going to be on-the-job training. I will show you, trust me, I will show you along the way what needs to be done. In other words, if we take the first step of faith in our lives, God will have our back, and he'll constantly and continually show us what he wants us to do along the way. I'm a witness. Y'all, I'm a witness to this. I don't know if I ever told you guys this. I was not supposed to come to Texas, okay? My college scholarship was in California. I was a band member, and I was going to University of California at Berkeley to march in the band. Don't know if I ever told y'all this or not. And everything had been worked out. Junior year, right, the spring of my junior year, and I told you this part, my buddy and I were going to go out to a club, and he said he couldn't because, you know, he had obeyed God. He's a Christian. He can't do that now. Remember I told you this. And I said, oh, you done found Jesus? I want to see this. And, you know, I ended up studying with the same people that he studied with, and I obeyed the gospel. And that was July of 78. And so my minister comes to me, and he said, you going to college? I said, yeah, going to California. He said, now, as a Christian, don't you think you need to go to a Christian school? Well, Jerry, it didn't take this old boy long. When he posed the question, I said, well, you know what? Yeah. He said, well, I know of a school. And this is the part, he and I have laughed about this later. Southwestern at the time was only a 2-year school, okay? So he said, I know of a school in Texas. If you don't like it, just stay for 2 years and then you can just leave. I didn't know at the time, Ernest. It was only a 2-year school when I was there. It was 4 years after we left and came to Abilene. So I said, you know what? And he was very influential in my life. I said, Brother Chisholm, you know you're right. What's the name of this school? So he's Southwestern Christian. Okay. I took it to school, took it to the counselor, and she said, oh, Mr. Famble, you're here to sign your Berkeley letter? No. I want you to look up this school. Never heard of it. Okay, I'll call him. And she looked it up. You know this is only a junior college. Well, yeah, but it's a Christian school, and, you know, I feel like I need to go there. Okay, I'll set up a tour. No, I don't need a tour. My minister already told me. Everything's good. I have no money to get from Georgia to Texas anyway. It'd be a waste of money. Just sign me up. So I signed up for school, college, actually. And I didn't see the college until we drove on campus. And we drove from the DFW airport. I think it's about 3 hours. I can't remember. And we drove on campus, and I got to campus at night. So it was completely dark. So by the time we got into the room and got to sleep, I didn't officially see the campus until I woke up the next morning, and they were going to start student orientation. And I remember standing in the middle of the campus. The middle of the campus is a circle. You come off of Moore Avenue, and you drive a circle through the middle of campus, and you drive on out. And I remember thinking, Lord have mercy. what have I done? Where am I now? And I can only, you're right, it's hilarious. It's a funny story. And I can only imagine as Moses was obeying God and going along the way, and God had already said to Moses, I got you. I'll train you, I'll teach you along the way. I was like, Lord have mercy. What has this old Georgia boy done? And I've told you this part before. We walked to the store and the people talked funny and they had trucks with guns on the back of the thing. And I'm from Atlanta and I'm like, Lord have mercy. And the lady, we buy something and you want a sack? I'm like, what, ma'am, what did you say? I've told you that part before. And I called my mom and I was really ready to go home, y'all. That was it. I was done. Stick a fork in this old boy. And mom pushed my button as only parents can do. Okay, Junior, come on home. Your room's still waiting for you, but I ain't known you to quit nothing in your life. I'm like, what did she say? She did it on purpose. I know she did. Years later, she would tell me that she did it on purpose. The point is, I took that leap of faith, and everything from that point forward, I was trusting God, and now here we are. I've been a deacon, I've been an elder, and now none of that was on my personal radar. All I can tell you is, by the time I got on that plane to come to Texas, until today, my life has been about faith and trust in God. God has guided me every step of the way. I don't know exactly how Moses felt. I don't. But I understand something about faith and about trust. I'll take some comments from you, but let me give you this one. I did it last week, and I want to use this again. What's the big deal? And then we'll go on. I'm going to jump to now the 10 plagues. But what's the big deal? To serve God effectively, we've got to depend on his presence and his strength and not necessarily our abilities. To serve God effectively, we've got to be ready for some difficulties during the mission. I may go back and pick up this next week. Moses ran into a bit of trouble along the way doing this. Okay, everything wasn't smooth sailing, and we all know this from reading it. It doesn't mean just because you step out on faith and you walk by faith and not by sight doesn't mean you're not going to have some rough days. And then to serve God effectively, we've got to be obedient to his commands. And I can tell you, guys, every step of the way, I've fallen occasionally, but I've gotten back up. But every step of the way, I have been obedient to God, especially when I personally didn't want to do it. What's the bottom line? I used this last week, and I'll use it again, and I'll take comments from you guys. God doesn't call the qualified. He doesn't. God qualifies those he calls. There's no way in the world that Moses could have said when he was beating about that burning bush, there's no way in the world Moses could have said, I got this. He had to trust God. And by faith, he had to walk by faith and not by sight and trust God every single step of the way. And God was orchestrating his steps all along. And the rest of it we know. The rest of it we know is history. So what's the bottom line here? What's the takeaway? If we're going to trust God, we need to stop putting up our excuses, and we need to trust God no matter what. And when God shows us and we run out of excuses, then and only then, I think that was the point that represented total surrender when it came to Moses and his relationship with God. Questions, comments, anything anybody want to say? Any questions or comments? I'm going to skip ahead a little bit next week. I'm going to get us right in front of the chapter in front of the 10 plagues, because the same way that Moses had to go through his stubborn period and his excuses when it came to God, his back and forth, I'm going to show you the same thing with Pharaoh. Pharaoh had to go through his stubborn period when it came to his attitude with following God's instruction. I'm going to start a little bit before then, and next week we'll jump in. We'll jump into talking about those 10 plagues and look at the commonality of what God was trying to do. And I'll give you a little sneak peek if you're following us on Wednesday nights when it comes to miracles of Jesus, those 10 plagues, the same way the miracles affirm the authority of Christ, those 10 plagues over the nature of the time affirm God is in control, especially when it came to the life of the Egyptians and to Pharaoh. It's all about the authority of God. Any questions, comments? Thank you very much. Let's be dismissed and get ready for our morning worship. Thank you all very much.